So my chapter in this compendium is titled Disability Daily Drawing, a Comics Collaboration, which showcases a portion of my longitudinal daily comics project that I created to amplify my daughter Simone's voice. She was born with the genetic difference, Down syndrome, which is an intellectual disability. And I want to share her intellectual, affective, and communicative differences, and significantly to share without speaking for her. And so today I want to speak to authorship and how I operationalized a collaboration with Simone. I'm guided by the knowledge that when we speak for others, especially vulnerable persons not often heard from, we can reinforce their silence. They remain a subject, their voice is appropriated, their stories told by others, their right to express their worldview remain dependent on the will and desire of others. I look to the disability rights movement mantra, nothing about us without us. To begin, my project took place in the ordinary days of family life, where for 3 years I drew a 4-panel comic every day from May 2016 to May 2019 to the accumulation of 1,085 pages of comics. So here's one of the 4-panel comics. Probably, well, not quite a year into the project. My drawing style changed and evolved. You'll see that I'm sharing a few of the different comics. So I distilled our exchanges to a single page with particular attention to what seemed to be Simone's focus, not mine. I used the general mechanics of comics, panels, gutters, speech bubbles, sketched quickly in ink with no underdrawing or concern for getting it right. I tapped into the process of trying to sense Simone, and I found that 4 panels allowed for a regular way to think through the structure and rhythm as it was predetermined. I tried to cut out other variables, such as I would draw at the end of the day, and I would take no more than half an hour. I didn't want to sort of allow my rational or biased brain to insert itself. I did not record the narrative of our life, most of which happened outside the frame of the comics. It was a singular encounter, and collectively they combine to create affective traces rather than a narrative arc. And you'll see these phone letters repeat in multiple encounters. It's kind of the Linus's bag, or sorry, blanket that he might carry around. They're just something that she always has with them. She has names for them. They have their own personalities, and they've been in her life since she was a toddler, and she's now she'll be 17 in February. So they have factored consistently in her life. So it was important to capture them. I often learn about Simone in her school, at the doctor's, and from others who interact with her, but I learned from her when I slow down enough to listen and observe, as was necessary in order to draw the comics. Halloween the other night, it's not, she would rather give out candy than collect it, just a different way of being in the world. There are challenges to creating and collaborating with Simone. Her expressive language is sometimes unclear. There are language misreadings and misunderstandings, and sometimes communication between us can be indirect or nonverbal. Her attention span, self-stimulation activities, sensory sensitivities can also influence my interactions with her. And my own biases and understanding of behavior are also in play here. So, for example, when Simone stands frozen, refusing to move, she's often called stubborn. It's a documented feature of Down syndrome, if you look it up. I try and suspend my preconceptions of typical behavior and consider perhaps she doesn't move because she's anxious, unable to verbalize, immobilized by internal forces, or more often interested in something that I am completely oblivious to. She opens up my eyes. I really began to notice this when I started drawing the comics. And it certainly was harder to do this daily, a lot harder than I realized, noticing and suspending my biases. And I used what is called mimesis, where I try and reflect back exactly what she was doing and sense what was important to her. And it took time and repetition to learn how to notice her priorities and translate them into material form. It was about an unbiased becoming with Simone. So people have often collaborated, but typically collaborators agree on through negotiation. This is my work. This is yours. We come together in this way, and that was not possible with Simone. So I found these writers and theorists, Silvers and Francis, who talked about social contract theory and who talked about maybe the foundation of the collaboration is based in trust as opposed to the capitalist realm and intellectual bargaining. And one which underwrites a method to working alongside her, to be with her and observe her, to sense her witness, to approach, to come close without speaking for. Which leads me to the concept of authorship. Simone is definitely vulnerable to authorial and conceptual exploitation. And I'm aware of the concerns and limitations of calling this work a collaboration, but then it leads to the question, how can all persons be an author, a purveyor of their own embodiment? And what if the person does not write coherently or speak in a logical cumulative language? I'm supported in this questioning this construction by scholar Rachel Adams, who says, written narratives continue to be a powerful source for giving voice to disabled lives. It's thus significant that the genre so stubbornly upholds the primacy of a single author, banishing the traces of dependency to the margins. And so by deliberately naming this project as a collaboration, I begin the process to challenge the primacy of a single author. Simone is the purveyor of her embodiment. I documented parts of it regularly with attention to the everyday, without hierarchy or privilege. So this myth of the individualism challenges the illegitimacy of single authorship. We are all manifestations of our entanglement with culture and history, our own biology, and the countless encounters that have shaped us. I find Roland Barthes' death of the author phrase useful, and I've modified it here. A text or comic consists of multiple writings or drawings, issuing from several cultures and bodies, and entering into dialogue with each other, into parody, into contestation, and into understanding. This trajectory through my method and philosophical underpinnings highlights the foundations of a collaborative project with Simone. I start with our trusting relationship and embrace her differences. The repetitive mediation of sensing and drawing creates a large partial record of everyday life from her point of view. She is my collaborator and co-author. And here I'd like to show this because she consented absolutely to this on a regular basis. She engaged with the project more and more over the course of the 3 years. And when I first started, she wasn't really reading, and now her reading is really come along, and she understands the lexicon of reading comics now. Anyway, she got in the habit of laying out my work for me, and she told me to do it. So I felt that was her giving me permission. So thank you for listening.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, JoAnn, for that. Thank you, Paige. Thank you, Craig, for this. This has been a really wonderful experience of collaboration for all of us. And one of the things that happened as we were working on this was that we got the chance to comment on each other's essays. And so in that spirit, I want to thank Crystal for her wonderful comments on my essay, which I think improved it, and it was a real pleasure. So I'm so glad to have been in interaction with you. I first met JoAnn when she came to a pathographics conference in Berlin. And I think I'm only now realizing how involved and engrossed and in touch with each other we are in terms of the work we're doing. I heard echoes of my work in yours, in the sense that you were talking about things that I'm going to talk about now too. And I'm very grateful for the resonances. So what I want to do is start by saying JoAnn has laid out the territory for us. Okay, I'm going to return to some of it by returning to Nothing About Us Without Us. It was a call for access to voice and control that was first uttered by people in the organization Disabled People South Africa in 1993. And the global transit of this phrase, I think, is extremely powerful, and we should remember it. And it raises a question, however, for those of us working in disability studies. How can we create authentic life writing when we're dealing with a disability that is intellectual or mental? We're very familiar, those of us who do work in graphic medicine, of comics about physical disabilities, the spiral cage. There are endless comics that deal with physical disabilities, but intellectual and cognitive disabilities raise a particular different issue for us. And Tom Kauser has written about this really in an illuminating way, talking about the way that if we're dealing with the case of disability and if the collaborators have uneven power positions, one person could be appropriated or misrepresented by the other. Now, JoAnn addresses that, and she's shown so beautifully how walking alongside her daughter, Simone, enables her to work with Simone to create a vivid collaborative work of life writing. I want to go on from there to talk a little bit about two more comics that show how people with intellectual disability can contribute to authentic life writing through collaboration. And I'm talking about a collaboration that is both aesthetic and social. In Henny Beaumont's Hole in the Heart, pictured here, which, full disclosure, comes out in the book series I edit with Penn State Press, the graphic medicine book series, the comics collaboration between the visual and the verbal reveals the complex truths associated with having a child with Down syndrome. And here, visual and verbal are collaborating in this three-tiered panel. So we see the verbal on top, as Henny says to her husband, this, her daughter's Down syndrome, has ruined their childhood. They will never be able to love her. But then right below that, in the visual, we see three children, the two older girls and the baby at the bottom. And the two older girls are saying, come on, it's my turn to hold her. And the other one saying, that's not fair. I've only had a little go. And so these three different positions are juxtaposed visually and verbally in one panel, really giving us a sense of the complex, multi-layered experience that is welcoming a child with intellectual disability into your home. Now I can go to the next image. Thank you. Oh no, wait, back up. I want to go to the back one. Still with Hole in the Heart. The collaboration also takes place later in Hole in the Heart, toward the end, when in the resolution, when Beth joins her mother to tell the story of her birth, and they start co-narrating it. And the mother describes her birth, and you came shooting out like a rocket. And Beth says, like a rugby ball. So again, there's this collaboration and a sort of moment of Beth having the agency to put her own story out there. Okay, now the next panel. Comics can also create authentic life writing by a person with a disability by appealing to what Frederick Kohlert, in a wonderful book that's come out recently called Serial Selves, he identifies as multiple literacies. That is visual meaning, audio meaning, gestural meaning, spatial meaning, and linguistic meaning. And Miranda Burton's Hidden is a lovely work of life writing, telling the experience of Miranda, who is working as a teacher, an art teacher in a school for adults with intellectual disabilities. This is an experience she had in Melbourne, Australia. And in this story, which tells the story of Miranda working with these adults, we watch and see how the multiple literacies, graphic markings, sounds, loved objects, and shared spaces all contribute to meanings that really transcend the verbal and that allow multiple experiences to be spoken, to be articulated at the same time. So they show, rather than telling, how Miranda's adult students find access to voice and agency to express themselves. And in this first, you can go to the next one now. In this first image, you can see this is Eddie. And Eddie is very upset because he finds out that somebody, one of the other adults in the art school, is having a bad day. And he comes to Miranda and he expresses himself the way Eddie always does, with these graphic scratches on paper. What Miranda does, however, is, and I love this possibly, she offers a potential translation for her, but she allows that it's only possible. Eddie saying, "Can't you hear her? She needs help." And then Miranda says, "She's in good hands." And he responds again with his scratches. "She's crying and you're just standing there." And she doesn't do anything. And so he turns tail on her. If you go back one page, you can see the big picture. If you go back one slide, yes, he turns tail on her and he grabs the tissues and he says, "Here are the tissues. Now, are you coming with me or not?" Again, this is an asterisk. It's her attempt to mediate between his visual communication and her attempt to understand. And then if you go back to the next slide, you'll see Eddie marched in while everyone else stood back in fear. He just saw someone who needed help. All right. In the next slide, we see that this also changes. What's changing here is not only Eddie's experience when she teaches him, but Miranda's experience when she learns from Eddie, because she learns from Eddie to see the world differently. Next slide, please. All right. I was thinking of this when JoAnn was talking about Simone's attachment to the felt letters, or those letters, because here Eddie is very attached to initials. And when he puts the initials up, he doesn't ever interpret them. He's just drawing and there they are. So Miranda says, "These initials, P and S, you keep writing them. What do they mean?" And he says, "Pig and stupid." So he's communicating about his own experience of these initials meaning something to him about words he's heard quite frequently. Okay, the next image. Miranda doesn't really think about it anymore. She says, "I soon forgot about pig and stupid, maybe because Steve stopped using the initials in his drawing." Sorry, this is Steve, not Eddie. Then one day in a cafe, I started staring at the salt and pepper shakers, and she thinks, "Ha, pig and stupid." And then she starts drawing them. And before she knew it, she had a P and S diary filled up with salt and pepper shakers from all over the town. So he has influenced her vision of the world and populated her world. And she said, "I enjoyed drawing their unique shapes. They were all so different, and yet they held the same ingredients." So in these two comics, and this is kind of my conclusion, in these two quite different comics, what we see, and you can go to the last slide if you want, the strategies of collaboration, and I mean aesthetic collaboration as well as social collaboration, and recourse to multiple literacies, making it possible for cartoonists working alongside people with intellectual disabilities to create authentic and agential life writing. And these are the texts that I referred to. Thanks very much.
Okay. I'm Julia Watson. Susan, thank you. That was so insightful. And thanks to Paige, Carolyn, and Craig for organizing this brown bag. It's lovely to be on this panel, and it's great to see the other panelists, at least virtually. One day, maybe we'll actually get together. Because I recently had a little medical encounter myself, in the interest of coherence, I scripted my presentation, and I hope you will bear with my reading it. Oh, I have to. Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. I'm dealing with Letting It Go by Miriam Katine. She's a Hungarian-American artist who's published 2 book-length comics with Drawn and Quarterly, We Are on Our Own, and Letting It Go, which came out in 2013. Oh dear, now my cat's gonna attend too, sorry. As well as shorter ones. I admire her ability to range high and low at once, her witty self-reflexivity, and the elegance of her drawing, which often uses borderless images on the page rather than panels. As like Katine, I've had a long, since 1965 in fact, and complex relationship to Berlin. I wanted to focus on Letting It Go, which centers on the German capital. So I'm going to talk about a few images very briefly. While Katine's is not a straightforward illness comic, it deals with a terrain that medical practice is often dismissive about. Upheavals in the body that may have a psychosomatic origin, but present as physical attacks. I call these in my title dis-ease with a hyphen, somatic manifestations of unresolved bodily issues. You have to leave it alone. While there's considerable literature on Holocaust trauma and post-memory, Katine tells that story in a new way that involves drawing herself out of it. She was indeed a child survivor in Hungary when her mother had to escape with her as a toddler from both the Nazis invading Budapest in 1944 and the Soviet troops that pursued them, with nasty encounters in both cases. In Letting It Go, Katine's persona Miriam, whom you see here, with her, of course, Nazi inscribed balloon, returns to that unresolved burden of angst and anger when their adult son decides to settle in Berlin and needs her to authorize his application for EU citizenship. So in 2010, despite her lifelong hatred and avoidance of Germany, she and her husband take 2 trips there for exhibitions of her artistic work. I'm going to very briefly discuss a few of these self-representations, and I've opted to show a very wide range. The first one is what I call, and what she calls, I guess, silly about Berlin. Although Katine narrates to an extent chronologically, there are frequent meta-narrative reflections on her project. Of the range of Miriam, her avatar's feelings as, to quote her, a crazy old lady who admits her view of Germany is warped and fueled by a resentment that her drawing seems to both acknowledge and work through. This full-page drawing is in colored pencil, visualizes her silly phobia of refusing to acknowledge Germany's existence. Hey. Notably, her middle finger is reserved for Wannsee, the location outside Berlin, where in 1942, senior Reich leaders met at a grand villa to plan the genocide that would sweep the continent. Now I want to show you a very different kind, and I'm happy to return to these, but in the interest of time, I'm doing these briefly. When after much delay and deliberation, she and her husband arrive in Berlin, in Miriam's perspective, markers of the horrific Holocaust past tower over the many recent monuments critical of war in the rebuilt, thriving city. They encounter the so-called stumbling stones, or Stolpersteine, embedded in the sidewalks of cities throughout Germany that mark buildings from which Jews were taken after 1938 and deported to extermination camps. Although the stones are only 4 by 4 inch bronze plaques with the names, dates, and camps of inhabitants engraved on them, they loom up as massive mementos that dwarf the couple and evoke that horrific history. Now I'm going to switch in the interest of time again. to very different kinds of drawings. What I can't develop at length here, but the essay explores, are the scenes of Miriam's own dis-ease in the extreme encountered on both trips to Berlin. The first time, as the result of eating a heavy meal in their hotel room, she is overcome by diarrhea. The anguish of her body is depicted in 19 wordless panels, one of which is shown here. Although no reference is made, of course, these scenes recall the daily misery of concentration camps. Her self-depiction in economical line drawings as an aging woman immersed in her own abjection is minimal but moving. Now, so far, all of this may not sound very funny. He doesn't think so, but hey, it's comics. Letting It Go is full of biting satire, self-deprecating irony, and insider jokes about how the body responds to physical insults. So let's look at another of those. One of several ways that Katyn introduces levity about Miriam's dis-ease is in the recurring form of invasive insects, which, believe me, saturate this comic. There are the so-called German cockroaches, a real term, a sturdy species that invade their New York apartment and cannot be fully exterminated. Another is the bed bugs that selectively attack her and only her on her second trip with her husband to Berlin for another show of hers. After visiting the exhibit, she discovers in the hotel bed that she has been mysteriously bitten all over. Another sly reference to the sordid condition of the camps, among other things. Her depictions of scratching herself are both painful and comic. So let me conclude with a last one. Indeed, the graphic memoir's last words are given over to the bedbugs. Elegantly attired as businessmen with fedoras, briefcases, and umbrellas, bedbugs contemplate how Miriam's blood will be shared now that she will be part of Berlin forever. As one says, she said she'll never come back to Berlin. The other said, ha ha, her blood will be all over the city. That will call her back. So to me, what Katyn achieves here is not the same story of Holocaust victimage and the kinds of not only traumatic, but indeed physical illnesses that can come from that have been narrated in so many memoirs and comics, and that she criticizes in Letting It Go. Rather, Katyn's is a new story. Now, you can't get on the computer. Oh gosh, Tunde, can you still hear me? Shoot.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay,
We can still hear
I
you.
just turned off my screen. I'm so sorry. I thought I had this worked out. I fed him already. Of the costs and pleasures of letting a deep post-memorial dis-ease go, as in the balloon of Letting It Go's cover, such dis-ease and the somatic eruptions it can produce are outside the institutional regime of medicine, but all too familiar to a cartoonist focused in Bessel van der Kolk's phrase on how the body keeps the score. Thanks. So bad.
Oh, Suzy, you're muted still.
There we go. So thank you, Julia, and your cat for that collaborative thing. No, it was a wonderful piece, and actually it fits into the work that I do, which isn't bound by frames and boxes in the comic. But I also want to thank the University of Hawaii for having us and for printing the beautiful and paid moderating this, and also in Chicago and stuff. So I came at this from an academic view. I got a friend of mine who is an academic forwarded the call for papers because she knew of my work with graphic medicine. So I had to familiarize myself with terms like mediality and more generally epistemology, so then I could go ahead and make fun of them in my essay, which I entitled, if that's what you want to call it, an illustrated RXA for graphic medicine. So the question that was compelling to me was graphic only apply to comics, which really got at the, I guess, medial affordances and limitations of the. My feelings about the topic were stronger experience or business writing a call for paper. Because I thought when we are looking at what is graphic medicine, we are also going to be looking at what it's not. Where did that go? There it is. I actually didn't even know graphic medicine existed until I was on a narrative brought together in this collection through Virginia Woolf's On Being. Time I was asked to be on this panel because I've authored a couple of memoirs. I had brain surgery, what's your excuse? And about the baby decision, getting pregnant, early parenting. So after the panel, in that audience, someone came up to me among the the hundreds of that came forward. Who to say, actually, I should consider graphic medicine and being conversation, and that there was a conference happening in the Philippines. For me, was out of the budget. But a couple of years later, the International Graphic Medicine Conference took place in White River Junction, Center for Cartoon Studies in Dartmouth, and I'm part of the cartoon there. So I was really excited, got myself all, decided I would participate in the marketplace. And in preparation, I was in camping with my family in Vermont. Graphic Medicine Manifesto, which was held graphic medicine. And as I was reading it, I was getting more and more people, and I was looking forward to meeting them at the conference. Before the conference, when I started to get concerned that maybe they weren't my people because my stuff, and maybe my work was more of a stepsister or a half sister to the conference itself is a really welcoming and wonderful, and you from Julia's slides of Cartoon's work that comics is a pretty liberal and broad term. Argument that we keep that term open is that, comic art is a complex art form created primarily by comics artists. And the form does have some times when telling can be better than showing. And there are other times when the variety of visual media that are available to people encountering medicine and medical experiences can more accurately or capture a narrative or move it. Those are the term graphic itself relates more. So as I showed in my essay in the first, have my character sort of break out of that box and land on the next spread where you can see the type of variety of and more lengthy text that sort of characterizes the type of work brain surgery memoir. So what I came to is that there are also readers for whom comics are tougher, and there's also cognitive science research that shows that the process of processing comics is different pathways in the brain. Participate and more people to in a general benefits that are accrued from either creating or reading the work. So I guess my argument on that level was for more access, and then on the more personal level, I was hoping to be a part of the club. So that is my essay in the book there.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for your talk so far. It's really just an honor to be a part of this collection and to be here. So thanks, everyone who made it happen. I'm Crystal, and I usually just like to give an image description or self-description of myself in case there's anyone who's vision impaired, or maybe you're just calling in and not using your screen. So I'm an Asian woman. I'm in my 30s. I've got long blackish hair. I'm calling in from my office. It's sunny, and I'm in California right now. So let me just set my timer so I don't go over. My contribution to this chapter was on the book you see on the screen. This is Dana Walrath's Alzheimer's Through the Looking Glass. And I actually discovered this work at one of the Pathographics conferences where I also met Susan Squier. So it's really cool to kind of come full circle and have this piece published. And so, I just want to talk briefly about the form first. So as you can see, collage is a big aspect of the aesthetic of this book. It kind of breaks out of the traditional comics form. And as Suzy was talking about, I think this variety of the graphic form is also just so important and part of why or how this work does a lot of the things that it does. So it, doesn't use panels and gutters. It really transparently preserves the work's origins, which is it was a sketchbook. And so there's the sketchbook portion of Alzheimer's that typically appears on the left side when you open the book and you see the page spread, and has these pencil drawings collaged with cutouts of Carol's Alice in Wonderland. And you get the occasional like scraps of colored paper and photographs in there as well. And then, so you have the images, and then you have the vignettes also. So Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderlands, in my essay, I talk about how it plays a really large intertextual role in the comic with regards to how it reimagines narratives around dementia and aging, but also around family stories that have to do with the memory of the Armenian genocide. And so in my piece, I essentially argue that Walrath really wants to draw our attention to the sort of ethical obligation we have to read dementia and trauma as inextricably tied, but not necessarily linked, right? And so I argue that it's the text is really careful not to suggest definitively that dementia is a symptom of trauma here, but it nevertheless still tries to draw attention to what it might mean to consider aging and dementia as kind of embedded in issues related to legacies of structural and militarized violence. So the next image that is pulled up on the screen here, it's one of two that I discuss in my paper. This one is an image. Oh, sorry, can you go back to the last one with the broccoli? Yeah. Okay, so this one is just kind of to describe it, you have Alice with the paper collage cutouts of Alice in Wonderland, and it says that night broccoli grew out of Alice's ears. She saw endless possibilities. Broccoli is good, but apples is better. And this was a really interesting moment in the text because it accompanies a vignette called Apples Are Better. And that's the first time that readers are introduced to the subject of the Armenian genocide for the first time. And so there's this interesting like juxtaposition that always happens between the images and the vignettes, right? So the vignette is talking about how Alice was, never a starving Armenian. And then she discusses how Alzheimer's impacted her relationship to hunger and food. And then she sort of pairs this lighthearted narrative about Alice gaining weight with a segue into a more serious account of Alice's parents, one during the genocide, and how Alice's hunger now might be a distant childhood memory of that trauma, right? That spans generation. So there's this sort of interesting interplay between talking about dementia, but also talking about transgenerational trauma. And then you have these sort of whimsical images of Alice, right, with the broccoli that signal sort of, plentitude and even for fertility, right? And so something I trace in my paper is just how we can talk about the juxtaposition of text and collage, how that sends readers down these kind of like rabbit holes of interpretation, right? In thinking about both experiences of dementia and Alzheimer's and also experiences of the Armenian genocide, and really sort of telling the story of starvation alongside this image of fantastical growth makes kind of talking about the horrors of the Armenian genocide more not palatable, but possible for the reader in a kind of different affective register. And it's very similar to, I think, what, some of what Julia was talking about with Catan as well, of sort of transforming a story about horror into something different. So there's all kinds of these non sequiturs that happen in the book, and these interesting juxtapositions that come about. And then you can go to the next slide. And so I'll just talk about this briefly since 5 minutes goes by really fast. So the other thing that my chapter really tries to emphasize is the way in which this text and this material process of collaging really is trying to emphasize the kind of material, real presence of Alice, right, with dementia. And that really is to provide a counter narrative to this idea that Alzheimer's and dementia is necessarily a disappearance of the self or a loss of the self, right? And instead, she's really asserting her presence, her materiality, the fact that she is still here, and disappearance is instead redefined as something like transformation. So she pairs the Alice with the image of the Cheshire Cat, for example. And her disappearance is instead a very kind of curiously fantastic power. In this image, you see, the text says she isn't losing tangible parts, though she is disappearing. And I read this image alongside these vignettes that talk about how Alzheimer's, makes certain parts of her disappear, especially her kind of internal governor, and she really just starts to say exactly what's on her mind. And you have the emergence of a very different kind of self, a self that is still very valid and important, and you get this kind of co-construction of this narrative, kind of taking us back to some of what Susan and JoAnn were also talking about with the kind of collaborative processes that the comics medium enables. And so I talk about this in my essay, but in short, it's the comic form here really allows us to get new kinds of stories about, about Dana, about her mother, and about the Armenian genocide as well that were not talked about before. And it's this resurgence of a kind of new family history that's really important, as well as this assertion of the humanity and the validity of her mother's identity with dementia. So Sorry, I don't want to go over, but I'll stop there.